Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Hire webinar on this lovely Wednesday. We'll start in a few moments with proper introductions and going through everything. But as you are joining, as you are logging in, do drop us a note. Let us know where in the world you're joining us from. I'm in quite dark London at the moment, so it's 4 o'clock for me. Tony, where are you joining us from?
I'm in close to San Francisco, so not too far away.
Oh, nice. So early morning for you. So 8 o'clock, 8 a.m. your time.
It is. It is. The kids are getting ready for school somewhere. So
Oh, nice. Amazing. Well, like I said, let us know where you're joining from. We've got quite an international audience with our LinkedIn and our hire group. So it's always great to know where people are joining from. And I guess that kind of brings me on for a little bit of an introduction to Hire for anyone who might be new to the community, or maybe this is your first time joining one of our weekly webinars. So my name is Kelly McGrath-Smith. I'm the Community Director at Hire. And if anyone hasn't joined Hire, just to give you a little bit of a background to who we are. So we are a global community of internal talent and HR professionals. So we've got over 10,000 members globally at the moment, which is absolutely amazing. And our main community lives on in Slack. So we have various kind of sub-interest groups, places for folks to come and discuss any challenges that they might be facing in TA, just have someone to kind of bounce off as well. It can sometimes be a bit of a lonely world. There's a lot of people who are maybe in standalone roles or find themselves heading up or leading quite a large team for the first time. So there's always space for people to come in and find someone to speak to, or just kind of run ideas past as well. We like to kind of look at ourselves almost as the hive mind of global TA. So if you have a question or something that you're burning to get an opinion on, it is a good place to come to. And we kind of see ourselves as, being on a bit of a mission to up level the industry, so to speak, as well. And part of that is also having these weekly webinars. We also have roundtable events in person as well as virtual. So depending on where you are in the world, hopefully there will be something for you. So I'll just pop the details below if you're not already a member. So you can head to hirehq.com to sign up, and hopefully we'll see some new faces in there as well. And I've just seen a comment. We've got someone from Madison joining us. So it's always nice to see where folks are joining us in from. And I just wanted to chat a little bit about today's webinar and what we'll be discussing as well. So I'm joined by Tony Lee, who's the head of Global TA at Mission Cloud. So it's amazing to have Tony here. And in this webinar, we'll really be chatting through recruitment enablement as your team's superpower. So what it involves, how you might be able to implement strategies to help raise the bar. And one of the things that I always like to say at the start of the webinars is please do feel free to add your thoughts, questions, comments as you go within the chat here, and me and Tony will be able to pick them up. We always love to have these webinars as interactive as possible. There's always a replay available, so you can obviously rewatch and revisit, but the joy of joining live is you'll be able to actually take part, have your questions answered as well. We will have a Q&A at the end too. So you can, of course, ask questions then. But if there's anything as me and Tony run through a conversation that you want to add to a question, please do, and we'll get to those questions as well. And on that note, I'll hand over to Tony to introduce himself and let you know who he is, just so you can meet Tony. So Tony, over to you.
great. Well, thank you so much, Kelly and Hire for inviting me. But yeah, my quick background, who I am. I'm Tony. I'm the head of talent acquisition over at Mission Cloud, which is a premier AWS partner. And yeah, I mean, I've been probably doing this for, I don't know, longer than I want to admit, over 15 years. I've been lucky to be at Mission Cloud, lucky to have been with a contentful late stage SaaS company, Get Around, kind of a unicorn car sharing peer-to-peer app, Workday. And then if anyone remembers AskJeeves.com, I was there for a while, many years back. And in every space, I've been lucky to have. It's mainly in the tech space,
Mm.
and lucky to have such great teams and leadership where the thought was, how do we see the evolution and try to convince people how to uh, look at recruiting more than just a sales transactional kind of group. And that's where enablement kind of started coming into play. So I'm excited to share my thoughts and feelings around it, but it's definitely not the end all be all definition of enablement.
Amazing. And I think maybe that kind of brings us closely to the point in terms of, I guess, your recent experience with enablement, and maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview in terms of what's kind of been going on for you in recent years from an enablement perspective.
Yeah, it's funny because I would have never thought I'd be giving this conversation about enablement because, uh, truth be told, like let's say maybe even recently, if not 5+ years ago, um, I feel like I was making this up for the most
Mm.
part, like, or let alone give it a definition. So, and I think a lot of hopefully others can connect with me on that, which is sometimes I feel like you're making it up. Like the
Mm.
recruiting space, the sourcing space, scheduling, maybe operations and data, um, but the idea of like, well, where does your marketing live? Where is your talent attraction? Um, uh, where does um, where does your diversity live, or your interview training? If you have a bar raiser program, just or even just those ideas in general. And I think a lot of people in the past have thought about like program management, project management, but what are you managing and why?
Mhm.
And over time, it felt very much my role personally, and I felt like I was borrowing recruiters or coordinators or anybody. Like, can I get 10% of your time? Can I
Mhm.
borrow you to do this? Who wants to update Glassdoor? Who wants to do LinkedIn social media posts or Twitter posts today? And after a while, it felt like, well, why are we borrowing people's time? How do we make this more of a intentional motion? Um, and and it's funny because I grew up my roots were more technical recruiting, as in like engineers, product,
Mhm.
uh, and it wasn't until I started switching to go to market that I realized there's this enablement function in sales, where it's like, so sales account managers get all the glory. It's like, oh yeah, I find the client, I land the deal, I get the party, I get, I go have the fancy dinner, but like who actually does all the grunt work? Like who completes the contract? Who gets all the things signed? Who sets them up in the system? Who sets them up with professional services and and whatnot? And so it's one of those like not so glorious roles, but at the same time, like just because you sign the deal doesn't mean that it's done. And that's how I feel about recruiting and enablement is
Mhm.
who does all the other work and who actually gets it done, and can that actually add value to the recruiting team. And so we formalized it. I had some great partners, great leaders, especially my last company, who really supported the idea of, well, from a top-down perspective, why do we care about interview training across the board?
Mhm.
Why do we care about having a solid foundation? Why do we care about attracting more people to the company instead of going to go find them? And so we can talk about results later, but in all, like we nearly doubled our ability to hire with the same amount of people, because we people interviewed the same, they prepared the same, they were looking at the same aspects to raise the bar, and we were more intentional about how we talked about our company, who was in our company,
Mhm.
how we looked at diverse talent, um, and just setting ourselves up for success made it easier to be successful, as opposed to grinding every day. Like, where am I going to find this person? And
Mhm.
so that's what enablement means to me is uh, who, but more or less like who's behind the scenes that's going to make everyone else successful.
I love that. And I think one of the things that actually, Tony, you and I spoke about recently was the term recruitment enablement. And, I think I was telling you that certainly kind of here in the UK, it seems like a new enough term, but actually it has been coined as recruitment project management, PMO sections. There's different ways that you can almost classify recruitment enablement. And I guess in terms of, if you look at almost like the essential foundations, if someone's looking at, trying to maybe build up a recruitment enablement function, or build a kind of bare bones in terms of what that can look like at a very early stage, if their company or their function doesn't have it, what would you say are kind of those essential components to look at initially?
Yeah. Depends what stage you're at. I mean, if you're a larger company, then more than likely you have some of these resources in place already, but they're probably more siloed. And I like the idea that you establish a department that finds these synergies together. Like I think when we were prepping for this, one thing that came up was like diversity, for example. Often a larger company, as you get larger, that becomes its own little like, what's the TA diversity team? But my counter to that is, well, what is that diversity team doing? Are you just creating partnerships and setting expectations on your talent pools across the company? But you have an enablement function. So I'm going to skip a step. So instead of laying the foundation, let's say you've already laid the foundation, but what are you laying is
Mm.
talent marketing, talent branding, uh, communication templates, interview training. But then again, like from a diversity perspective, you'd want to include unconscious bias in your interview training, or how do you define diversity and what are we trying to strive for in the company, and set that foundation across the board. Or if you're doing talent marketing, talent attraction, who are you spotlighting? What partners are you working with? Do you post your article on LinkedIn, or do you post it on Mom's Project or Built In, or um, or Jobwell, and then share that article on that platform in LinkedIn, and then try to attract a diverse community. But the point being is, if it's seeded in every single aspect, or talent attraction is seeded in interview training, or bar raise is part of um, uh, a training program, these are all interconnected. So why not it be one department? Um, Going back to your question earlier about foundation, um, uh, this will be relatable to if there's any past folks who I've worked with here. One, hi, I miss you. You're all great. Um, but then two, they'll probably relate to this, which is foundationally, I think the question is, well, what do you want to achieve? Are you struggling with people knowing what your company name is? Are you struggling with um, selling your diversity? Maybe you have a bad Glassdoor score, and so the question then is, well, then how do I combat that? And is it talent marketing? Do I have hiring managers who change their role halfway through, or have inconsistent scorecards? How do we lay foundation for interview training? But if you're early, nimble, or this year and last year, a lot of TA teams are budget strapped, resource strapped. Well, then where some of my former colleagues will relate to is how do we sneak in some roles and responsibility into your current job?
Mm.
And so that's what I've been successful at in the past, is saying, hey, uh, if I give you a few less recs, or if you schedule half as much, would you want to pick up this role, or would you
Mm.
want to help with talent marketing, or do you want to help me build an interview training? Would you want to facilitate and train, or I can give you 3 more jobs to work on? And most of the time, a lot of people are like, I'd love to do more. And my intent then is, how do I hopefully turn? I think with establishing a enablement function, my attitude has always been, to a certain degree. I mean, my former bosses are here, don't listen. But I don't like anyone else. It's like, just do and ask for forgiveness later. And so, kind of one of those things where, let's just get you this responsibility. Let's establish that we can do this. Let's try to get a few things out quick, see if it works. If it doesn't work,
Mm.
reassess. But my intent always is, how do we use the resources we have for success? And if they're successful, how do we pivot that person into that role permanently? And so I've been lucky to have a great teams today and in the past, who have taken on so much, uh,
Mm.
to a point where, like, it's funny. Some folks I've worked with in the past, like, it's like, hey, 10% of your time is this, now 20%, 40%, to the point where like the issue isn't what job you're doing. The issue now is like, I got the wrong job title for you. And that became my enablement team. Uh, in most companies I've been at, if I establish this department, I've only ever hired externally for this group, maybe 10-15% of the time. Everyone else was, how do I get people within the recruiting team to create this department?
That's amazing. And I think it also kind of ties in quite nicely to, I guess, what the market has been saying and acting like for the last year or so, in terms of, I think a lot of folks working in TA are trying to future proof their careers to a degree, or maybe they're at that point where, you know, they actually love project management, but they're still passionate about the world of TA. And actually, you know, can there be a pivot for them as a recruitment project manager, for example, or like you said, a recruitment marketer? Um, and have you found that kind of when you've done that, has it felt like the transition has been a little bit easier than with folks who, you know, understand the world of recruitment, understand the team, and you've kind of helped move along versus, you know, trying to build from scratch?
Well, yeah. Yes and no. I mean, no in the sense of like, let's say you're trying to build a talent marketing function, then or talent branding. It's like you need an EVP. Like some experience you just can't replace, or like a graphic designer. Or I can't tell you how many times um, we needed a video edited, and it's like, who can do this? And the hours it spent just trying to fake it on our own. So there's some skills that I think, yeah, you definitely need support, or maybe if you're doing a lot of it, like hire that talent. Um, but in general, I think a good example is maybe more on the ops side. Is in the past I had an amazing person, smart, young, ambitious, and to this day still amazing. But I know a challenge for him in the beginning was he knew data, he knew our process, he knew data, he knew models, he knew um, dashboards, everything we needed technically. But the challenge was understanding time to fill uh, and funnel ratios
Mm,
and funnel conversions, and why does that data matter? And if one day it was 100 days to fill and another day was 20, like, well, that's a flag, And so I think the institutional knowledge to agree, like, in fairness, like there's nothing. That person ended up becoming one of the best employees I've ever had. Um, but I remember the amount of conversations we had, which was trying to understand, why do we recruit? How do we
mm,
recruit? Why does that behavior matter? Um, and so, um, uh, so arguably, he's the counter to this comment, because there's always exceptions. But I would normally say the person who is in the talent space, um, it's so nuanced or just so
mhm,
behavioral sometimes that I think it's important. Because going back to the enablement example, like, what is sales enablement, and how are they successful? And I think the way they're successful is they're best friends with finance and legal, and deal desk, and compliance and IT. And so that's kind of how I see recruiting enablement as well. Is um, that's your foundation, top down leadership. How do you get the support? But
mhm,
then um, how do you may not be the video expert or the technical trainer or the content writer. And so marketing, legal, sales, wherever you can get the resources, they become your best friends.
yeah.
So that's how I see success in our team. Is, yes, I'd rather bring someone in who was a recruiter or a coordinator, or knows the talent or HR space, because what it's like in the behaviors of hiring managers and candidates, and what candidate experience should look like, and then all the other skills we partner with to learn, grow, and establish. And so that's why I see enablement more as a cross-functional.
Mhm.
I mean, going back to project management,
Yeah.
we're that go-between. In all fairness.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think it kind of brings us nicely, I guess, looking more into, I guess, like the strategies and insights in terms of what it actually looks like. And we've kind of touched upon it there, but when it comes to, you know, building up or setting up this function, is there anything that you would look at from, you know, what do you really need to help set up your team to actually thrive in this space? Like you said, you've probably got maybe a mixture of folks who some have TA experience, some don't. You're trying to almost, like you said, based on the sort of business you work for, figure out, do you need someone from a marketing perspective, from a Glassdoor perspective? So what would be your kind of advice or maybe your experience in kind of that setting up to thrive stage?
Yeah, I think I would say one size doesn't fit all. Um, and it depends how big your team is, because what I'm about to say could easily, sometimes there's too many cooks in the kitchen.
Mhm.
What I've done with groups in the past is, um, don't let me tell you how to do enablement, or what's the other side of recruiting. You tell me, but let's take what data we have or what experiences we have. And so what I normally do when I can is get the group together, and we brainstorm, and we, as simple as Google Doc or Asana or just Notepad, and say, hey, what are we seeing, what are we hearing? Uh, it's taking too long to hire.
Mm,
It takes 3 days to get scorecards back. We're losing candidates because um, they're in process for like 4 to 6 weeks. Nobody knows who we are. I can't explain equity. Our candidate survey says that we're no different than any other company. And so that's kind of like, so we take all
mm,
that pile of whatever, and then we try to sort it out. And what we've done in the past is like almost like, I mean, most people are virtual now, but imagine like a whiteboard, and you just
mm,
get stickies and you put all the issues on the board, and then you vote on it. Because I think that's the other key to enablement is, where I say one size doesn't fit all. What are your issues? And they
mm,
could be completely different than another company. Once you figure out what your issues are or what people want to influence, then what we did was we just prioritized them.
mm,
Uh, some had to go in a bucket of like, we have to solve these things, but then there's others like, well, what are nice things to have? Um, and a term that I learned over the last couple of years is, you could technically put the entire kitchen sink in there, um, but if you try to fix everything, you'll end up fixing nothing. And so
mm,
the term I learned, the hard way over the last couple of years was ruthless prioritization. And so, uh, like for example, diversity, defining it, uh, spending money on partnerships, like for a good 2 out of 3 years, we put that to the side, not because
mm,
it wasn't important, but because the amount of time it would have taken. Um, how do we, what's a low hanging fruit around diversity that we could affect in enablement? But if the foundation for interview training and a bar raiser program wasn't there, then what's the point of diversity if
mhm.
people are on the same page? And then once that was established, you can then start injecting more other components in there. So that, foundation, that's how I would say you get started, is figure out what your problems are, figure out a way to prioritize them, and then tackle them one at a time, and figure out who does what where.
And it's an interesting point you mentioned around the diversity piece. And I think you were saying that actually in your kind of previous role, diversity sat within recruitment enablement. Maybe
Yeah.
you can chat a little bit about, you know, the benefits there. And like you said, when it comes to unconscious bias training and the interview process and how that kind of work together.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I'll say, one quick comment there is, it's one thing to ruthless prioritization. It's also another thing to procrastinate forever. And so I think I've been guilty of both.
Mhm,
Um, but uh, but to answer your question, I think, uh, there's that prioritization exercise. What do we want to accomplish? What are our problems today?
mm,
Um, and I think as you prioritize, you realize there's some things that you feel really bad about. Like, well, if I'm going to move diversity down 10 steps, but that's really important to us. And, you know, sales is 20% women, and engineering is going to lose they're down to one ethnic diverse, like everyone, our buddies are buddies from school. We have to affect it. And so there's, I mean, one, go back and know your data.
mm.
Um, but, hold on a second. Sorry, my wife's AirPods connected to my
Oh,
computer. But but one, know your data. I mean, that's probably the other biggest struggle, that why we deprioritize diversity, was mainly because, um, we didn't know what to affect if you don't know where you're coming from. So that's a whole different conversation. But no, it's one of those things where what are the underlying things that you always want to care about, which is
Mm,
for us at the common ones for me in the past was candidate experience, um, uh, feedback, how hiring manager experience, and how fast we do the feedback, get feedback, and then diversity. So even if we couldn't make it a priority and put projects behind it, there were still themes that we always talked about. And so that's the other thing I would consider, like when you plan or figure out what you want to do, what's still important to you and how do you still seed it? And so as we built interview training, um, someone always asks a question, well, what about diversity? Or can we
mm,
add a slide or two about it? Or what trainings have people done that we could complement in this? And so for us, a good example was just unconscious bias.
mm,
Uh, uh, the interview training I've done at this company that exists today at this company and the one in my last one, the focus is more around skills based and behavioral training, and that to me inherently has an underlying diversity tone of, well, the goal is how do you not bias? How do you not go by your gut? How do you look at the facts and the experience to determine if they're going to be a good hire or not? But then how do you teach that across the board that that's what we're looking for? Um, and so I think there's some things that you'll do that always have an underlying tone to something. And so we took the underlying tone and we threw it in their face somewhere in there and said, okay, let's test your bias. And um, uh, ideally for me, the next iteration is microaggressions and then other points. But I think that's the other thought too. Start small, which
mm.
is get something in so you get it in, but don't try to boil the ocean, as you get going.
I really like that. I've heard a few people say that on webinars recently. Don't boil the ocean. I was like, oh, that is definitely a
I know. If I
really
could write
good
a
way.
book about corporate terminology,
Yeah.
but it'd probably be like 1,000
No,
pages.
but it's good. I think, especially, you know, we have a lot of folk who join the webinars more from kind of startup land, and actually, it's really hard at first because you do want to tackle everything, but actually, like you said, sometimes it is starting small, like you were talking about earlier. Take a step back and look at actually what's going on in your organization, actually have that prioritization in terms of what needs to be affected when, because what you'll often find is one of the things you want to affect, you have to do three things before you can get there,
Yeah.
which I think is an interesting way to look at it as well. um, I've just noticed we've just got a question come through from Mark asking, have you received pushback from other departments who feel topics or initiatives sit more within their remit?
1,000%. Not just if they think it's in their remit, but also like, why am I doing this?
Mm,
So I'll tackle it in two ways. If departments think it's in their remit, like for example, I was at a company once where engineering traditionally, historically, had been the largest department, and so they grew faster than the rest of the company. And so what ended up happening was they had to figure out stuff that the rest of the company wasn't prepared for, like um, what are our interview questions, what are our levels, what are we looking for, how do we hire. And then as the company grew and we tried to create a standardized process across the board, we fought with them saying, well, we do it this way, well, we do it that way. And so uh, on the flip side of that, I've had departments in the past where they said they cared, but they just didn't do anything about it. Uh, um, and so in both situations, I think the goal is, how do you get senior leadership involved if you can? Make it a top down, like, here's why I'm doing this, especially like, let's say interview training. Um, Here's my goal for achievement, and here's the results I think I can do. And if senior leadership's on board, then it's easy to say, well, Bob and Jane are on board, and so let's give it a try, because at this point, senior leadership wants to see results and at least test it. Um, if you have that, or if you have this, at the end of the day, I also think you just need one champion. And the way I've done in the past is, and I wouldn't do this anyway, which is try to convert a whole department or a whole company overnight. I mean, you're just definitely inviting things to break, and then people to say, well, it didn't work, and then you just fail. Um, so I think it should be a rollout a phase process anyway. And then as you phase it out, like test it on a department or a team or one manager who hires a lot. But in my opinion, you only need one champion, um, because I think the secret sauce of today's business and recruiting society is data.
Mm.
Um, and so it's easy to pitch something without data, but and easy to ignore, but it's hard to ignore when you have real world examples, um, with good and bad data subsets and say, hey, this worked. We hired 5 days faster when we started interview training with this group, or the feedback was more consistent, over here. Candidate surveys for this group have increased 10%, like whatever it is. Once you start having those results, then you have a leg to stand on. It's like, well, hey team, I know you're resistant, but I've hired faster, and with better feedback over the last 2 months just with this one group. So let's give it a try. And that's usually how we've attacked it. It's more conversations,
Mm.
but I think it's what you need to get the support, you need. Going back to foundation, like that's the key. I think is champions. You're always going to have the naysayers, but at some point when you get enough champions, then the ones who aren't part of the program feel left out. And I think that's the goal I usually try to have, is make people feel bad that they're, get them as much FOMO as possible. Um, so, but yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Mark.
No, that's really good. And I think, Mark, if there's any points that you want to follow up and let us know. One thing I was going to ask, kind of off the back of that, is when you're looking at it from a kind of reporting and data perspective, and like you said, kind of almost creating that FOMO to show, actually, look, this is one cohort or one group that we did this with, and this is the results. What would be your take in terms of, like, how can you really showcase the benefit to an organization of having like a dedicated recruitment enablement function? Like, what would be the steps, and I guess any kind of reporting that you found really worked to kind of actually get that buy-in?
Yeah. I think, to be honest, what I mentioned before, like, all the stats you have today, I think the key there is just how do you put a bookmark in it and say, so I wouldn't say change any way you report today. If you don't have these, then I recommend you most ATSs today will give this information to you, probably not in a pretty way or easy way, but if you find your rhythm, then you can do it. But your time to fill, time and stage, candidate satisfaction score if you do surveys, average time for people to fill out feedback scorecards, percentage of actual people actually complete feedback scorecards, are just a few things. But in my opinion, your typical everyday other recruiting metrics, if you have a TA ops team, that's amazing. If you don't, please get one. But break it down by department, break it down by manager or region if you can. Sometimes you see themes by region if you're international. You see themes by departments. But then, so once you have that foundational TA ops data, then I put a bookmark in it, and say, well, I'm starting this program today. And so my data up until now has been X. And then my data starting when I created an interview training or did talent marketing, 30 days, 6 days, 9 days later, did I see improvement? And in a lot of cases, we didn't see improvement in some places, which means either it didn't have any effect or we were already doing it well. But so that's the other trick I've learned over the years. I had one leader who was very good at storytelling, in the sense of, why do you have to show the same data every single time, every presentation? And why do you have to show the good and the bad? Not to say you're hiding anything, but highlight your successes and talk about an opportunity, but it doesn't have to be the same data every time. So one month it could be, we improved time to fill by 30%. The next time it could be, hey, we increased candidate satisfaction by 5%, and you admit the last data. And so that's how I sold enablement was, by doing this, we've increased this behavior. And if you have a regularly scheduled leadership download, usually it's like monthly or quarterly, that's where I normally would introduce it. If you don't, then I would look at how do you use Google Slides and Google Sheets, and build a presentation and just start sharing it with each department as you have conversations with them, to a point where they're like, I want this information all the time.
Mhm.
And so I think that's how we won people over with, a good example is, we had a campaign earlier this year, at one of my last companies, where um, they were questioning, like, do we put a resource dedicated to talent marketing and to talent branding? And so we played around with like social media posts here and there. And there's one innovative employee who said, you know what? Um, this year is a tough hiring year. Let's highlight employees instead of like the company and the product, um, and rallied uh, over 100 women at the company, on during Women's Month, and just asked them, hey, can everyone post an answer to this one question on the same day? And I think we had over 100 women answer the question, what does success mean to you? We had them pre-write what they want their responses to be. We put it together. We had marketing, leadership take a look at it, and then on the day that we decided to post it, we had over 250,000 people view our 100 people's posts. And that moment, we realized that's a full-time role. If it wasn't a full-time role before, it's a full-time role now, and no one questioned it after that point. So, so yeah, I think it's the little wins that you can get, or the data that you can share, that just proves the success that you can have, or the behavior that you want to create.
Absolutely. And it's also, I think, one of the kind of components we spoke about as well is that kind of evolution of recruitment and like that perception of recruitment. And I think certainly what the last turbulent year or so has taught us is TA functions really need to be seen as strategic partners, and like more than just filling roles, because you can go through really busy times where the focus of the team is of course hiring, but actually there's so much more to it than that. And actually you can, like you said, be working on LinkedIn social media marketing campaigns, you can work on bias training, interview training. Have you found that, or did you find that actually the more kind of senior folks or more hiring managers within the business actually started to see recruiters and the recruitment enablement function more as that, like that strategic partner through this work? Did it kind of help bolster that sentiment?
Yes, definitely. Yes, I think it made it harder. Where I've looked in my previous companies, and peers, I definitely seen it harder for businesses to cut recruiting, as one like terrible example, because they became more than just transactional employees. Because if they're transactional employees and you no longer have any sales, or in this case, like any recs to recruit on, then yeah, if you're transactional, then I don't need you, because my 500 roles became two. Um, and so I definitely think that by having had put a focus on TA operations and TA enablement, has definitely made us more partners, strategic
Mm.
partners, but also um, added value to our roles, where I can use this skill set somewhere else, or I can future proof this. At the very least, you're creating this whole institutional knowledge
Mm.
beyond just sourcing, recruiting, ATS, whatever. I think you create this, like, well, if this person leaves, who's going to run our interview training? I mean, that's a whole different problem of succession planning. But uh, but like, if someone owns your social media and all your content and all your last copies, and then someone owns your all your decks and has facilitated and managed all your schedules, you then become like an invaluable, indispensable person, whether you're hiring or not. Because ideally, you're going to hire at some point again in the future, and when you do hire again in the future, to replace that knowledge could be like, I mean, not to say recruiters are expendable, but at the same time, like, from my experience, on average, it takes about 60 to 90 days for a recruiter to start finding their stride. But um, but the recipe and the formula is fairly consistent from one to another. The knowledge is different from company to company, but the behavior is kind of the same. But when I've had to hire someone who has been a non, and that's the other reason, going back earlier, of why I want to promote the enablement team from within, because the ramp up time is lower. Because if I had to hire someone externally to learn interview training, how we do diversity, even operations and our data, it's usually like a 6-month ramp up time,
Mhm.
because your environment's so unique to whatever the topic is. It's not like a rinse and repeat. I'm going to schedule, I'm going to source kind of role. Um, so yeah, I think that's kind of my unintentional but secret reason why having enablement as well is I hopefully your role then becomes harder to fire,
Yeah.
and it feels weird saying that, but I mean I think that's the times this year for the recruiting space. Um,
Yeah.
so if you can future proof yourself, or uh, I think the theme of the year also besides diversity is internal mobility.
Mm.
Um, and in a space of like how do you not fire people, how you promote people, how do you give people skills, which by the way internal mobility is also something that I would say is also enablement.
Mm.
But but how do you skill up your employees at your company? Well, recruiting is a very nimble flexible space. I mean it's like I feel like it's a lot of silos and microcosms within our own org. And so um, if you're having a hard time finding a role for your team, well, give them the skills today so that if that ball drops again in the future, well, half your team could become marketing or sales or project managers or even legal or HR. So so yeah, that's my take on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. And actually, there's been a number of kind of TA leaders that we've spoke to kind of over the last few months who that has been such a focus, and these folks don't necessarily always have recruitment enablement functions, but actually they've tried to move some of their team members on almost like a secondment, so for 3 months while it's slow in hiring, they move to sales, or they
Yeah,
support with marketing. And, what's been really interesting in terms of the conversation is some people actually find that when the team members moved, that's what they want to do, especially when people are maybe a little bit more junior in their careers, and they might not want to do recruitment forever, but actually they like and they know the space, so actually being able to move into more of a marketing role but still lean into that recruitment space is quite a nice transition for them as well. And
yeah.
to your point, you've got you know less of a ramp up period, and people who actually understand and are passionate about the business, the nuances of the team as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, hopefully, if there's a great recruiter community on this call, uh, then I think everyone will relate to this. Is you probably didn't get into recruiting on you didn't go to school for recruiting. My guess is that most of this community has fallen into this role. Um, and what I mean by that, the reason I say that is, well, um, it probably wasn't the skill that you're expecting to use uh, whenever you started 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Um, and then the reverse of the converse of that is, well, okay, now you've been doing the recruiting space for however long you've been doing it, but do you want to recruit forever? Um,
Yeah.
and that's the sentiment I normally get when I work with my teams is, uh, how did you get into recruitment in the first place? And then do you want to be still making phone calls for the next 10 years? And a lot of people say yes. I mean, I've seen career recruiters who will retire as recruiters, and it's great. Um, but I think the vast majority are asking, well, what do I want to do next? And I love the talent space,
Mm.
but I don't necessarily want to keep making phone calls. So or spend 8 hours a day playing calendar Tetris and my mind exploding. So what's next for you? And
Mm.
that's where I see enablement as an opportunity as well. As well, let's intentionally add skills, vary your skills, do a different project. Um, uh, so yeah, I mean that was kind of that's how, to be honest, that's how this started for me in the first place.
Mm.
Was um, I didn't want to lose good talent.
Yeah.
And so how do I build skills for you? And then how do we make this into a permanent role? But I mentioned earlier, when times are bad, how do we make ourselves indispensable? But I've had moments in the past where when times are really good,
Mm.
that our team is so sexy that like literally I would get calls and emails and Slacks from other, well, at the time it was like Skype or whatever we used to
Yeah.
do before Slack. Um, and they would say, how do I join your team? Because our team touches almost everybody. And so
Yeah.
that was exciting too, of people like begging, what you do seems so cool. Can I join you? And here's, so So yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, I love that. And I think like you said, it is that piece around sometimes you have great team members and people move on, like you said, not recruitment may not be a forever role for some people, but if there's a way that you can actually use internal mobility and keep those people in the business, because often if someone is leaving because the role isn't for them, they may still really want to do something else if they can in the business.
Yeah.
Just got a comment come through from Mark saying, I like the idea of companies offering consultants an opportunity to diversify their skill set. Great support for internal mobility.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark, for the comment. And I have managed probably over, if you don't count retail, if you count retail, it's an absurd number. When I used to manage men's and women's shoes, and those departments were huge. But minus that, I probably have managed over 150 people in TA at some point over the last in my career, or and in various capacities. And I think the common theme across the board, and having had a chance to have connect with so many great people, was almost everyone. Rarely did anyone say I didn't love this space.
Mm,
Love talking to people, love influence people's careers, lives, events. I mean, that's another part of enablement. I feel like we don't talk about a lot because it's still virtual COVID, but university entry level,
mm,
career fairs, trade shows. That's a space that I think this group would have a lot of influence into, the enablement group. But the common theme among people has always been, I love talent acquisition. I love talent. Uh, it's the side of HR that doesn't make me sweat. Which, by the way, I can't imagine myself running HR because I have more fun in TA.
yeah,
But I think that's a sentiment. But I
yeah.
don't want to make calls forever. I don't want to schedule forever. And so people want to be in this space, but they want to really contribute in a way that gives them purpose as well.
No, exactly. And I think it kind of, brings us to the point where please do drop a line if you've got any questions. We're kind of coming up to time, but we're absolutely happy to do a Q&A. I just wanted to pull up a question that we've got from Abigail, and she's asked, what are some of the emerging trends in recruitment enablement, and how can organizations stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah. There's a sexy part, in my opinion, of recruiting enablement, and there's a non-sexy part, because, like I mentioned earlier, using the sales example, like who actually gets things done. Um, uh, the sales folks and the recruiters celebrate their successes, but then who actually gets them hired, signed? I
Mm,
mean, recruiters can do that too, but who attracted them? And so, in my opinion, the trends are usually the same as the company or the industry. Um, in for example, like internal mobility, I mentioned earlier, I think is a huge trend right now. Uh, um, but anything that's not, in my opinion, related to sourcing or scheduling, usually, and like, we're the other group. And so whatever trends you see in the market, it's probably enablement that's going to deal with it. Um, but to answer your question directly, internal mobility, diversity, but also data privacy, pay transparency, um, uh, job descriptions, diversity training. I'm seeing, it's funny because my last company, like not that I haven't heard bar raiser before, like Amazon and bar raiser definitely are popular, but the idea that companies are doing a bar raiser, or a way to, like, how do you come in and add more than what the rest of the team has? And since I've been there, I feel like maybe it's also like when you buy a new car, you see that same car on the road so maybe that's the situation. But I've seen so many companies um, uh, since my last role, including the one I came where I'm at today. They all have either a bar raiser, or a values champion, or an ambassador program. That is, if you don't have that already, think about how do you purposely have one piece of your interview that focuses on either values or upskilling, or both.
mm,
Um, uh, and that's enablement. I mean, so for me, the sexy part, uh, interview training, diversity, internal mobility, things that are very front facing that you can talk about to everybody. But then there's the other stuff that's just boring that has to get done, and that could be ops as well. But that's in my opinion, pay transparency, job descriptions, don't get audited, make legal happy. Um, but but yeah, those are probably some of the emerging trends that we need to solve for. And technology's catching, and AI is gonna be a big one, where it's like that could be a mix between ops and enablement depending on what you're trying to solve for. But do you use Chat GPT for job descriptions? There's tools out there that will summarize your Zoom interviews for you using
Mhm.
AI. Uh, uh, so how do you that I think is probably going to be the hottest emerging trend of, well, where does that live and who owns it, and what do we do with it?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I guess it's like watch this space, see how things evolve over time. But it's
Yeah.
definitely like an exciting space to be in and to
Well,
talk about.
watch this space slash guess who's going to be dealing with it. And if you don't already have an enablement team, then or a project manager or something,
Mm,
or an ops person, then and you want to get ahead of these trends, then I would say find someone, or start building this team.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we've just got one more question pop in here saying, except for AI-based skill tools to offer internal roles, what are the latest preferred trend or methods for internal mobility? Um, there's a second part to their question, but maybe we'll look at the internal mobility trends first, if you've got any insight to share on that one.
Yeah, my opinion is I don't normally try to uh, offer other people's services, but one cool thing I've seen recently, I was lucky to see a presentation at LinkedIn about their LMS, LinkedIn Learning, and formerly Linda, um, and the head of product who used to run LinkedIn Recruiting went over to become the head of product for LinkedIn Learning, and her entire goal was, how do we start creating synergies between these two platforms? So this is a very specific example that costs a lot of money. If anyone's ever dealt with LinkedIn before, which is probably everybody, they're not cheap and they're not easy to negotiate with. But if you have LinkedIn Learning and LinkedIn Recruiter, then theoretically, if you can get all your employees on LinkedIn Learning to
Mm,
say, I'm interested to log in, the first questions they ask is, um, are you looking to just get a promotion? Are you trying to change jobs? What development plan and skills you want to learn? And then what, based on your answers, it signals LinkedIn Recruiter, where you can then spotlight and search your internal employees on who's looking to make a move. So that's where I think technology um, purposely is set up in that way. Uh,
mm,
but so let's say you haven't spent $250,000 to $1 million on LinkedIn Learning and Recruiter, but that's still the same behavior. So you can do it manually on, if you have a pulse survey or an engagement survey, and just say, hey, who's interested in changing roles, and just get some kind of pulse on, well, who, where, when. And then you can then take your internal sourcing efforts, and it's like, if there's a large population that's interested, well, then start doing internal campaigns, create a Slack channel about internal channels, advertise your internal job board, create a weekly internal newsletter about the hot jobs happening right now. Um, and as opposed to the 5 skills you need for an external candidate, what are the 3 skills you need to learn internally to be considered for the role? So there's ways you can do it without spending $250,000, but it definitely takes effort. But
mm,
but that's the trends and methods I would probably deal with internal mobility. Is you got to figure out, first of all, who's interested. Um, do you, and if there's, and more than likely everybody, hopefully, and if that's the case, then that's a very uh, hand-in-hand relation with HR to say, well, then how do we capitalize on this? Because if we
mm,
can do this, that's also a retention factor. Because I mean, my argument for talent attraction, I'm starting to see a lot more TA leaders become TA and learning leaders.
mm.
Uh, and it's because the two things kind of go hand in hand, of internal mobility is becoming that important that it's becoming part of a recruiting function. So so intentionally, how do we source internal employees? Plus, if you can promote someone, I'd rather backfill the more junior role than the senior role.
Yeah.
So, um, I would say one of the meta trends is TA. If it hasn't already in your organization, the focus won't just be talent attraction. It's going to be
Mm.
talent attraction and retention.
Amazing. And we've got time just for one more question, which is, what do you think about referral programs? Are they still useful, and what should we consider or get rid of?
I am going to non-answer this question because I think it's very debatable. I've seen it on both ends. I'll give you my opinion. But where referral programs were like the be all end all, like easy solution still is to a certain degree. In the day and age of diversity and business success, you're starting to see the trend of, well, we don't want too many referrals because we want to make sure that we have a diverse population within that team. So, so what I think about referral programs, I think you need one, period. It's important to get employees involved. I think it's employee morale, and it's a sense of if your employee population is happy, if they want to refer people. So I think it's important. But at my current company, we recently had to redefine referrals, like, because what is a quality referral? You know, and give that extra definition to make sure people understood what we're trying to solve for. And but yeah, so to answer your question, it could go on either side. I think you definitely need one no matter what, but how much you advertise it, advocate for it, or push for it, really depends on you. Not to say that just because you have a referral program that you're going to get a bunch of one type of person. I think if you do it right, it takes time and effort. If you do it right and you get your diverse population referring people, then ideally you're getting a whole set of diverse referrals. So you got to be very intentful in how you build it and who you try to attract to it. Otherwise, if the only team that cares about it is the team that makes commission and wants to make more money, and so they see referrals as a way to make more money, they're going to hire all their buddies from their frat. Like that. You got to figure out how to expand your program and make it meaningful, or just don't do it at all and just have a policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. It's always lovely to have some input from people who are watching as well live. Tony, that was brilliant. It was a really engaging conversation. I feel like we could probably talk about it for another hour.
I think
It's
we
just
opened
one
up
of
like
those
6
topics.
different topics for the future, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting. So thank you for joining us. Thanks everyone for watching. I wanted to share next week's webinar, weekly webinar, same time, same place. So we've got Lauren on, who will be talking about imposter syndrome. So learning to work and live with it. And it should hopefully get a lot of people attending. I feel like this is a topic that quite a lot of people can relate to. And Lauren has actually founded a group called the Recruitment Imposter Network as well. So that will be on next Wednesday. And that is where we will leave you on this lovely Wednesday. Thank you all for joining. I'll pop the little banner below for anyone who wants to find out a little bit more about Hire. I always think this looks like I'm reading the news and there's just the latest headlines coming in. Head to Hire HQ. But it's been amazing having you, Tony, and I'm sure we'll chat to you very soon. And everyone else, enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays. Thanks very much.
Thank you.